The early morning stillness of Atlanta's Inman Park neighborhood was shattered by the sharp crack of gunfire. As dawn broke on that fateful summer day, residents awoke to the wail of sirens and the sight of police cruisers converging on a stately Victorian home. The address was familiar to many. It belonged to none other than Atlanta Police Chief Elijah Booker, a man revered throughout the city for his unwavering commitment to justice and community policing. But this morning, Chief Booker wasn't responding to a call. He was the subject of one. As news helicopters circled overhead and curious onlookers gathered behind hastily erected police tape, whispers began to circulate. Something terrible had happened inside that house. Something that would shake the Atlanta Police Department to its core and leave a city questioning everything it thought it knew about one of its most respected leaders. In the hours and days that followed, a story would emerge so shocking, so laden with betrayal and violence, that it seemed ripped from the pages of a pulp novel. But this was no fiction. This was the true story of how Atlanta's top cop became its most notorious criminal overnight. Elijah had been married to his high school sweetheart, Gabrielle, for nearly 2 decades. The couple had 2 children, a son in high school and a daughter in middle school, and were fixtures at community events. They seemed to embody the American dream, a shining example of Black excellence and family values. As Elijah took the helm of the APD, he promised a new era of transparency, accountability, and community-oriented policing. Crime rates were at historic lows, and public trust in the police was higher than it had been in decades. The future looked bright for Atlanta and its beloved police chief. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form in the foundation of Elijah Booker's seemingly perfect life. And at the heart of it all was a man who would become both his closest ally and his ultimate nemesis, Detective Xavier Rollins. Xavier Rollins was, in many ways, Elijah Booker's polar opposite. Where Elijah was smooth and polished, Xavier was rough around the edges. Elijah had grown up in a stable, middle-class home. Xavier was a product of Atlanta's toughest housing projects, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Elijah had sailed through the academy with top marks. Xavier had barely scraped by, his quick temper and problem with authority nearly getting him kicked out more than once. But for all their differences, the 2 men shared a burning passion for justice and a deep love for their city. They first crossed paths early in Elijah's career, when he was a young detective, and Xavier was a beat cop with a reputation for being a loose cannon. Elijah had been assigned to investigate a series of armed robberies targeting small businesses in Xavier's patrol area. Initially, the 2 clashed. Xavier resented what he saw as a hotshot detective encroaching on his turf, while Elijah was frustrated by Xavier's unorthodox methods and disregard for protocol. But as they worked the case together, a grudging respect began to form. Xavier's street-level intelligence and network of informants proved invaluable, while Elijah's analytical mind and attention to detail helped connect the dots. Together, they cracked the case, taking down a violent gang that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. In the process, they discovered a complementary dynamic that made them a formidable team. Elijah learned to appreciate Xavier's instincts and raw talent, while Xavier came to admire Elijah's strategic thinking and political savvy. As Elijah climbed the ranks, he made a point of mentoring Xavier, helping him channel his passion and skills in more productive ways. Under Elijah's guidance, Xavier matured into one of the department's top detectives, specializing in homicide and organized crime. When Elijah became chief, one of his first acts was to promote Xavier to lead the major crimes unit. Their partnership became the stuff of APD legend. They seemed to have an almost telepathic connection, anticipating each other's moves and thoughts. Their solve rate was unprecedented, and they took down some of Atlanta's most notorious criminals. The media dubbed them the dynamic duo, and their exploits were the subject of countless news stories and even a few true crime books. But their closeness extended beyond the job. They became fixtures at each other's family barbecues and holiday gatherings. Xavier was godfather to Elijah's daughter, while Elijah had helped Xavier's son get into a prestigious private school. They worked out together, watched football together, and often joked that they spent more time with each other than with their wives. It was a friendship that seemed unbreakable, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of police work and strengthened by years of shared triumphs and hardships. To the outside world, Elijah Booker and Xavier Rollins were the ultimate example of what could be achieved when two men from different backgrounds came together in service of a higher cause. But as with so many things in Elijah Booker's life, the reality was far more complicated and far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the summer of 2024 approached, Elijah Booker seemed to be at the pinnacle of his career. Crime rates in Atlanta were at a 50-year low. Community satisfaction with the police department was at an all-time high, and there was even talk of Elijah running for mayor in the next election. His face graced the cover of national magazines, and he was a regular guest on cable news shows discussing innovative policing strategies and urban renewal. But those closest to Elijah had begun to notice subtle changes in his behavior. He was working longer hours, often not returning home until well after midnight. When he was home, he was distracted and irritable, snapping at his wife and children over minor issues. He'd lost weight, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence under his eyes. Gabrielle Booker was particularly concerned. After nearly 20 years of marriage, she knew her husband better than anyone. She sensed a growing distance between them, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Elijah brushed off her concerns, blaming the stress of the job and the constant public scrutiny. But Gabrielle couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. Her suspicions were fueled by Elijah's increasingly secretive behavior. He'd taken to password protecting his phone and closing his laptop whenever she entered the room. There were hushed phone conversations that abruptly ended when she came within earshot. And then there were the unexplained charges on their credit card. Expensive restaurants, high-end hotels, jewelry stores. At first, Gabrielle tried to rationalize it all. The restaurants and hotels could be work-related. Elijah was constantly meeting with politicians and community leaders. The jewelry, well, maybe he was planning a surprise for their upcoming anniversary. But as the weeks went by, the excuses became harder to believe. She confided in her sister Naomi, who worked as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital. Naomi listened sympathetically, but urged caution. "You can't jump to conclusions," she warned. "Elijah's under a lot of pressure. Maybe he just needs some space." But Gabrielle couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. She began to pay closer attention to Elijah's comings and goings, noting the times he left for work and returned home. She started checking his shirts for lipstick stains and unfamiliar perfumes. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but dismissed the idea as paranoid. Meanwhile, at the police department, others had noticed changes in Elijah as well. His once open-door policy had given way to long stretches of time where he was unavailable, locked away in his office or out of the building entirely. Meetings were rescheduled at the last minute, and important decisions were delayed. Perhaps most telling was the shift in his relationship with Xavier Rollins. The two men who had once been inseparable now seemed to be actively avoiding each other. Their easy camaraderie had been replaced by a palpable tension. When they were forced to interact, their exchanges were clipped and professional, devoid of the warmth and humor that had characterized their friendship for so long. Rumors began to circulate through the department. Some speculated that Elijah and Xavier had had a falling out over a case. Others wondered if there was some sort of power struggle going on behind the scenes. A few even whispered about possible corruption, though no one dared voice such accusations openly. Xavier, for his part, deflected questions about the change in his relationship with the chief. "We're both busy," he'd say with a shrug. "Can't always be joined at the hip." But those who knew him well could see the pain and confusion in his eyes. Whatever had come between him and Elijah, it was clearly eating away at him. As spring turned to summer, the tension continued to build. Elijah became more withdrawn, Gabrielle more suspicious, and Xavier more troubled. Something had to give, and soon. Little did anyone know that the reckoning was just around the corner, and when it came, it would shatter lives, destroy careers, and leave a trail of blood and betrayal that would haunt Atlanta for years to come. July 15th, 2024, started like any other summer day in Atlanta. The air was thick with humidity, the cicadas buzzed incessantly, and the city sweltered under a merciless sun. For most of the city's residents, it was just another Monday. But for Elijah Booker, Gabrielle Booker, and Xavier Rollins, it would be the day that changed everything. Elijah had left for work early that morning, kissing Gabrielle goodbye with his usual distraction. She'd watched him drive away, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Over breakfast, she made a decision. Today was the day she would confront Elijah about her suspicions. She couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. At the police department, Elijah went through the motions of his day, his mind clearly elsewhere. He canceled a meeting with the mayor's office and spent most of the morning locked in his office, emerging only to bark orders at his assistant before disappearing again. Xavier Rollins, meanwhile, was knee-deep in a high-profile murder investigation. A prominent real estate developer had been found dead in his Buckhead mansion, and the pressure was on to solve the case quickly. But Xavier was off his game. He snapped at his junior detectives and made uncharacteristic mistakes in his questioning of witnesses. As the day wore on, the paths of these three individuals began to converge, drawn together by forces they didn't yet understand. Around 6 p.m., Gabrielle received a text from Elijah. "Working late. Don't wait up." Her heart sank. It was the final straw. She made up her mind to go to the station and confront him there if necessary. At 7:30 p.m., Xavier wrapped up his day at the precinct. He was about to head home when he received a cryptic text from an unknown number. "Motel 6, room 237. Come alone. You need to see this." His detective instincts kicked in. It could be a trap, but it could also be a lead on his case. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to check it out. At 8:15 p.m., Gabrielle pulled into the parking lot of APD headquarters. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering her courage. Finally, she took a deep breath and walked into the building. The night shift desk sergeant greeted her warmly. Everyone knew the chief's wife. "He's not here, Mrs. Booker," the sergeant said apologetically. "Left about an hour ago. Said he had a meeting." Gabrielle felt her world tilt. A meeting? With whom? Where? The sergeant shrugged uncomfortably. "Didn't say." But he hesitated, then seemed to make up his mind about something. "He left with Detective Rollins." Gabrielle's mind raced. Elijah and Xavier had barely spoken in months. What kind of meeting could they be having? And why had Elijah lied about working late? She thanked the sergeant and walked out, her legs feeling like lead. In a daze, she got back in her car and sat there, trying to decide what to do next. That's when she noticed the GPS tracker app on her phone, the one she and Elijah had installed to keep tabs on their teenage son. On a hunch, she opened it and checked Elijah's location. The little blue dot pulsed steadily, showing Elijah's phone at a Motel 6 just off I-85. Gabrielle felt a wave of nausea wash over her. With trembling hands, she started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know what she was going to do when she got there. All she knew was that she needed answers. And she needed them now. As she merged onto the highway, she had no way of knowing that Xavier Rollins was already at that same motel, standing outside room 237, his hand poised to knock. And neither of them could have imagined the horrific scene that awaited them, a scene that would forever alter the course of their lives and send shockwaves through the entire city of Atlanta. The neon sign of the Motel 6 buzzed and flickered in the gathering twilight as Xavier Rollins stood outside room 237. He hesitated for a moment, his cop instinct screaming that something wasn't right, but curiosity and a nagging sense of duty won out. He knocked firmly on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Atlanta PD," he called out. "Open up," still nothing. Xavier's hand instinctively moved to his service weapon. With his other hand, he tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned out easily. The door swung open with a creak. The scene that greeted him would be forever seared into his memory. The room was dimly lit by a single bedside lamp, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. And there, in the middle of the queen-sized bed, lay Elijah Booker, naked, unconscious, and clearly intoxicated. Beside him, equally unclothed and out cold, was a woman Xavier recognized with a jolt of shock. Kendra Watkins, a vice detective from their own precinct. For a moment, Xavier stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was Elijah, his mentor, his best friend, the man he had looked up to for years. The man whose family he had shared holidays with, whose children called him Uncle X. A surge of anger and betrayal washed over Xavier. Without thinking, he strode into the room and shook Elijah roughly. "Wake up, you son of a bitch," he growled. Elijah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "X, what are you doing here?" His words were slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. "What am I doing here?" Xavier's voice rose. "What the hell are you doing here, Elijah? With her?" He gestured angrily at Kendra, who was beginning to stir. Elijah struggled to sit up, his movements clumsy. It's not what you think," he mumbled. "Not what I think?" Xavier laughed bitterly. "It looks pretty damn clear to me. How long has this been going on? Is this why you've been acting so strange? Pushing me away?" Kendra was now fully awake, clutching a sheet to her chest, her eyes wide with fear and shame. "Detective Rollins, I can explain." "Save it," Xavier snapped. He turned back to Elijah, who was fumbling for his clothes. "Does Gabrielle know?" At the mention of his wife's name, Elijah seemed to sober up slightly. "Gabrielle," he whispered. "Oh God, Gabrielle." "Yeah, that's right," Xavier said coldly. "Your wife, the mother of your children. Remember her?" Elijah buried his face in his hands. "I've screwed up, X. I've screwed up so badly." "You think?" Xavier's voice dripped with sarcasm. The great Elijah Booker, Atlanta's favorite son, caught his pants down, literally. "Do you have any idea what this will do to the department? To your family?" As the two men argued, neither of them noticed the headlights sweeping across the motel room window. Neither of them heard the car door slam or the rapid footsteps approaching the still open door. It wasn't until they heard a strangled gasp that they realized they were no longer alone. Gabrielle Booker stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she took in the scene before her. Her husband, naked and disheveled, the strange woman in his bed, and Xavier, fully clothed but clearly involved somehow. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant rumble of traffic on the highway. Then Gabrielle spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah, what is this?" Elijah stumbled towards her, reaching out. "Gabby, please, I can explain." But Gabrielle was backing away, shaking her head. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice rising. "Don't you dare touch me." She turned to Xavier, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and fury. "And you," she spat. "I trusted you. We trusted you. You were part of our family." Xavier held up his hands. "Gabrielle, no, you've got it all wrong. I just got here. I didn't know." But Gabrielle wasn't listening. With a cry of anguish, she turned and ran from the room, her sobs echoing through the motel's dingy hallway. Elijah made to follow her, but Xavier grabbed his arm. "Let her go, man. You're in no state to." He never finished the sentence. With a roar of rage, Elijah swung at Xavier, his fist connecting solidly with the detective's jaw. Xavier stumbled back, more from surprise than pain. But as Elijah came at him again, something in Xavier snapped. All the anger, all the betrayal, all the hurt of the past few months came pouring out. He tackled Elijah to the ground, and soon the two men were rolling on the floor, trading blows, years of friendship evaporating in a frenzy of fists and fury. Kendra screamed, scrambling to gather her clothes. "Stop it! Both of you stop!" But they were beyond hearing. Blood pounded in Xavier's ears as he pummeled the man who had once been like a brother to him. Elijah fought back with the desperation of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Neither of them heard the approaching sirens. Neither of them noticed when the motel room door burst open again, this time admitting a flood of uniformed officers responding to reports of a disturbance. It took 4 cops to pull Xavier and Elijah apart. As they were separated, chests heaving, blood streaming from cuts and split lips, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Elijah Booker, chief of police, caught in a motel room with a subordinate officer. Xavier Rollins, head of major crimes, brawling with his superior. And somewhere out in the night, Gabrielle Booker, her world shattered, driving who knew where in a state of emotional devastation. As the officers began to sort out the situation, taking statements and calling for medical assistance, Xavier and Elijah locked eyes across the room. In that moment, they both realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Their careers, their friendship, their lives as they knew them, it had all unraveled in the space of a few chaotic minutes. And little did they know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, hushed conversations, and frantic damage control attempts. By dawn, the story had broken wide open. Local news stations led with grainy cell phone footage of Elijah Booker and Xavier Rollins being led out of the Motel 6 in handcuffs, their faces bruised and bloodied. Social media exploded with speculation, memes, and calls for resignations. At Atlanta Police Department headquarters, a crisis management team had been assembled. The mayor himself had been roused from bed and was now ensconced in a conference room, surrounded by legal advisors and PR specialists. The challenge before them was monumental: how to contain a scandal that threatened to undermine public trust in the entire department. Elijah and Xavier had been separated and were being held in different precincts to avoid further confrontation. Both had lawyered up, refusing to speak to internal affairs investigators without counsel present. Kendra Watkins had also been taken into custody and was facing questions about her relationship with the chief and potential misuse of department resources. But amidst all the chaos and recriminations, one question loomed larger than all others. Where was Gabrielle Booker? After fleeing the motel, Gabrielle had seemingly vanished. Her cell phone was turned off, and she hadn't returned home. Her sister Naomi reported that Gabrielle had called her in a hysterical state shortly after midnight, but the call had been brief, and Gabrielle hadn't disclosed her location. As the hours ticked by with no word from her, concern began to mount. By mid-afternoon, what had started as a tawdry sex scandal had morphed into a potential missing persons case. Elijah, despite his own precarious legal situation, was frantic with worry. He begged to be released so he could search for his wife, but the department refused, citing the ongoing investigation and concerns for his own safety given the public outrage. Xavier, for his part, was consumed with a toxic mixture of guilt, anger, and fear. He replayed the events of the previous night over and over in his mind, wondering if he could have handled things differently. Should he have confronted Elijah alone, instead of in front of Gabrielle? Should he have reached out to her earlier with his suspicions? The what-ifs tormented him. As day turned to evening, a new and disturbing wrinkle emerged. Forensic analysts processing the motel room made a startling discovery: traces of a powerful sedative in both the empty whiskey bottles and the bedsheets. The implications were staggering. Had Elijah and Kendra been drugged, and if so, by whom? Suddenly, what had seemed like a clear-cut case of infidelity and departmental corruption took on a more sinister aspect. Was this a setup, a blackmail attempt gone wrong, or something even more nefarious? The revelation threw the investigation into turmoil. Elijah and Kendra were quickly transferred to Grady Memorial Hospital for toxicology screenings and observation. Xavier, who hadn't consumed anything at the motel, was re-interviewed, his statement scrutinized for any details he might have overlooked in the heat of the moment. As night fell on Atlanta for the second time since the scandal broke, the city was a powder keg of tension and speculation. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, demanding transparency and accountability. Journalists camped out at the hospital and at the Booker family home, hoping for a glimpse of Gabrielle or any family members who might shed light on the unfolding drama. In a cruel twist of irony, the Major Crimes Unit, usually led by Xavier, was now tasked with overseeing the investigation into the possible drugging and the disappearance of Gabrielle Booker. Detectives who had served under Xavier for years now found themselves poring over his case files, searching for any connections or clues that might explain the events of the past 36 hours. And through it all, 3 lives hung in the balance. Elijah Booker, the fallen chief, his career in tatters and his family in jeopardy, waiting for toxicology results that could either damn him further or offer a glimmer of exoneration. Xavier Rollins, the loyal friend turned accuser, now caught in a web of suspicion and second-guessing, his every action from the past several months under intense scrutiny. And Gabrielle Booker, a woman betrayed, her whereabouts unknown, her silence speaking volumes as an entire city held its breath, waiting to see if she would emerge to offer absolution, accusation, or something else entirely. As Tuesday night deepened into Wednesday morning, one thing was abundantly clear. This story was far from over. The worst, it seemed, was yet to come. As the first light of dawn broke over Atlanta on Wednesday, July 17th, the city awoke to news that would send shockwaves through an already reeling populace. Gabrielle Booker had been found. At approximately 3:45 a.m., a security guard at Piedmont Park had spotted a woman matching Gabrielle's description sitting alone on a bench near the lake. She was disoriented and appeared to be in a state of emotional distress. Emergency services were called, and Gabrielle was transported to Grady Memorial Hospital, the same facility where her husband was undergoing toxicology screenings. The discovery of Gabrielle alive brought a collective sigh of relief to a city on edge. But any hope that her return might simplify the increasingly complex situation was quickly dashed. As details began to emerge about her condition and the circumstances of her disappearance, the case took yet another dramatic turn. According to initial reports, Gabrielle had no memory of the past 36 hours. Her last clear recollection was of leaving the police station after learning of Elijah's whereabouts. Everything after that was a blur of fragmented images and emotions. More alarmingly, preliminary medical examinations indicated the presence of the same sedative found in the motel room samples. The implications were staggering. Had Gabrielle been drugged as well? And if so, by whom? The timeline of events suddenly became crucial. Had she been dosed before arriving at the motel, explaining her extreme reaction and subsequent flight? Or had she encountered someone after fleeing the scene who took advantage of her vulnerable state? As news of Gabrielle's condition spread, the focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. What had started as a scandal centered on Elijah Booker's infidelity now looked increasingly like a coordinated attack on the entire Booker family. The list of questions multiplied by the hour. Who had sent the anonymous text luring Xavier to the motel? Who had access to the powerful sedatives found in Elijah, Kendra, and now Gabrielle's systems? Was Kendra Watkins a willing participant in the events at the motel, or was she another victim? And perhaps most pressingly, who stood to gain from the systematic destruction of Elijah Booker's career and personal life? As Wednesday wore on, a task force was assembled, bringing together detectives from major crimes, narcotics, and special victims. The FBI was called in to assist, given the possibility that this was an attack on a high-ranking law enforcement official. The motel room was re-examined with a fine-tooth comb, and security camera footage from the surrounding area was meticulously reviewed. Meanwhile, at Grady Memorial, a tense reunion was taking place. Under heavy guard and with a phalanx of lawyers and medical professionals present, Elijah and Gabrielle Booker came face to face for the first time since that fateful night at the motel. The meeting was brief and emotionally charged. Gabrielle, still groggy from sedation and reeling from her ordeal, vacillated between tears of relief at seeing her husband and flashes of anger as fragments of memory surfaced. Elijah, for his part, was a shell of the confident leader he had once been. The toxicology reports had confirmed the presence of sedatives in his system, lending credence to his claims of having been set up. But the damage to his reputation and his marriage had been done. As he tried to explain, to apologize, to make sense of what had happened, he was met with a mixture of confusion and mistrust from the woman he had built a life with. Across the hospital, in a secure wing, Xavier Rollins was grappling with his own demons. The revelation that Gabrielle had been drugged added a new layer of guilt to his already burdened conscience. He had been so quick to believe the worst of Elijah, so ready to cast judgment. Now, as the possibility of a larger conspiracy loomed, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. But even as the investigation expanded and new theories emerged, the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Social media was ablaze with accusations and counter-accusations. Conspiracy theories proliferated, ranging from internal department rivalries to elaborate plots by organized crime syndicates threatened by Booker's anti-corruption initiatives. Local community leaders called for calm and patience, but tensions in the city were reaching a boiling point. Small protests broke out in front of police headquarters and city hall. Activists demanded oversight and transparency, while supporters of Elijah Booker insisted on due process and a thorough investigation. As Wednesday bled into Thursday, the task force caught its first major break. A meticulous review of traffic camera footage revealed a vehicle of interest, a black SUV with tinted windows that had been seen near the Booker residence on the night of the incident, then later at the motel, and finally in the vicinity of Piedmont Park, where Gabrielle was found. The vehicle was registered to a shell company, but financial records pointed to a connection with a name that sent chills through the department: Calvin King Strickland, a notorious crime boss who had long been a thorn in the side of Atlanta law enforcement. Elijah Booker had made it his personal mission to bring down Strickland's organization, spearheading a multi-agency task force that had been closing in on the crime lord's operations. Suddenly, the events of the past few days snapped into sharp focus. This wasn't just about destroying Elijah Booker's career or personal life. It was about dismantling the entire apparatus that had been built to combat organized crime in Atlanta. By taking out Booker, discrediting Xavier, and throwing the department into chaos, Strickland stood to undo years of careful investigative work. As this realization dawned on the task force, a new sense of urgency gripped the investigation. But they weren't the only ones moving quickly. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday morning, as search warrants were being prepared and tactical teams assembled, reports came in of unusual activity at several known Strickland-owned properties throughout the city. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of not just Elijah Booker and his family, but the very soul of Atlanta itself. As Friday dawned, the city held its breath, knowing that before the sun set again, everything would change. Little did anyone know just how high the cost of that change would be, or the rivers of blood that would flow before all was said and done. Friday, July 19th, dawned hot and humid, the air thick with tension and the promise of impending thunderstorms. As Atlanta stirred to life, an invisible clock was ticking down to a confrontation that would leave an indelible mark on the city's history. At the Joint Task Force headquarters, a flurry of activity had been ongoing through the night. Search warrants had been obtained for multiple properties linked to Calvin King Strickland's organization. Tactical teams were being briefed, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was at stake. This wasn't just another raid. It was a fight for the very soul of the Atlanta Police Department and the city it served. Across town, at Grady Memorial Hospital, another kind of preparation was underway. Against medical advice and over the strenuous objections of his lawyers, Elijah Booker was checking himself out. The past few days had seen a radical transformation in the once proud police chief. The fog of sedatives had lifted, replaced by a burning clarity of purpose. He had been violated, his family threatened, his life's work jeopardized. Now he was out for justice and revenge. Gabrielle, still recuperating in her own hospital room, pleaded with her husband to stay out of it, to let the task force handle things. But she could see in his eyes a determination that both frightened and attracted her. This was the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Passionate, driven, unstoppable. For better or worse, she knew there was no talking him out of this. As Elijah prepared to leave, a nurse entered the room with news. Xavier Rollins was requesting to see them both. For a moment, the old anger flared in Elijah's eyes, but Gabrielle placed a calming hand on his arm. "We need to hear him out," she said softly. Elijah nodded, his jaw clenched. Xavier entered the room, his normally confident stride replaced by a hesitant shuffle. The bruises from their fight were still visible on his face, a physical reminder of how far their relationship had fallen. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The weight of betrayal, misunderstanding, and shared trauma hung heavy in the air. Finally, Xavier broke the silence. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I jumped to conclusions, let my emotions cloud my judgment. I should have trusted you, should have dug deeper before." He trailed off, unable to meet Elijah's gaze, Elijah's fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. Part of him wanted to lash out again, to make Xavier feel the pain and humiliation he'd endured. But another part, the part that remembered years of friendship and shared triumphs, held him back. "We were all played," Elijah said at last. "Strickland knew exactly how to push our buttons, how to turn us against each other, and we fell for it. Xavier nodded, relief washing over his face. The task force is moving on Strickland's properties within the hour. I came to warn you to stay away, to let us handle it. But, he paused, a hint of the old partnership flickering in his eyes. I'm guessing that's not going to happen, is it? A ghost of a smile played at the corners of Elijah's mouth. You know me too well, X. Gabrielle looked between the two men, sensing the shift in energy. Whatever you're planning, be careful, she said. Both of you. I can't lose either of you again. As if on cue, both men's phones buzzed simultaneously. They checked the screens, their expressions growing grave. It's time, Xavier said. Elijah turned to Gabrielle, cupping her face in his hands. I love you, he said softly. I'm going to make this right, I promise. With a final shared look of determination, Elijah and Xavier strode out of the hospital room, their steps in sync for the first time in months. As they reached the elevator, Xavier spoke again. You know this is probably a trap, right? Strickland's too smart to not have contingencies in place. Elijah nodded grimly. I'm counting on it. It's time we spring the trap on him for a change. As they stepped into the elevator, neither man could shake the feeling that they were descending into something far darker and more dangerous than they had ever faced before. The doors closed with a soft ding, sealing them in and setting in motion a chain of events that would shake Atlanta to its very foundations. Across the city, in a fortified penthouse overlooking the skyline, Calvin King Strickland watched a bank of monitors displaying live feeds from his various properties. A cruel smile played across his lips as he saw the police beginning to mobilize. Right on schedule, he murmured, reaching for a phone. Time to welcome our guests properly. As the first rays of the morning sun broke through the gathering storm clouds, Atlanta held its breath. The endgame was about to begin, and blood would flow before the day was done. The convoy of unmarked police vehicles and SWAT vans snaked through the early morning Atlanta traffic, lights flashing but sirens silent. Inside the lead SUV, tension crackled like electricity. Xavier Rollins gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, while Elijah Booker sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. You sure about this? Xavier asked, breaking the tense silence. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. Elijah's jaw tightened. Strickland crossed the line when he came after my family. I'm just returning the favor. As they approached the first target, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city, both men's radios crackled to life. All units, be advised. We have reports of armed individuals at multiple locations. Proceed with extreme caution. Xavier and Elijah shared a look. This was it. The convoy screeched to a halt outside the warehouse and organized chaos erupted. SWAT teams poured out of their vehicles, taking up positions around the perimeter. Xavier and Elijah, despite not being officially part of the operation, found themselves in the thick of it, old instincts kicking in. Atlanta PD, we have a warrant! The shout echoed through the early morning air, followed by the thunderous crash of the battering ram against the warehouse door. For a moment, everything was still. Then, all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from inside the warehouse, the staccato rhythm of automatic weapons filling the air. Officers dove for cover, returning fire as bullets pinged off vehicles and chipped away at concrete barriers. In the chaos, Elijah spotted a figure slipping out a side door. Without hesitation, he took off in pursuit, Xavier close on his heels. They rounded the corner of the building just in time to see a black SUV peeling away, tires screeching. That's the same vehicle from the traffic cams, Xavier shouted over the din of gunfire. Elijah was already moving, sprinting towards their own vehicle. We can't lose them. As they tore after the fleeing SUV, the radio chatter painted a grim picture. The warehouse raid had been a setup, a heavily fortified decoy designed to tie up police resources. Similar scenes were playing out at other Strickland-linked properties across the city. It's a diversion, Elijah growled, piecing it together. Strickland's making his real move somewhere else. The car chase led them through the awakening streets of Atlanta, weaving through early morning traffic at breakneck speeds. Xavier's driving was a masterclass in controlled aggression, keeping pace with the fleeing vehicle while avoiding civilian casualties. Suddenly, the black SUV made a hard turn, heading towards the heart of the city. As they followed, a sickening realization dawned on both men simultaneously. They're heading for the hospital, Elijah said, his voice tight with fear. Gabrielle. Xavier's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as they pushed the vehicle to its limits. The hospital loomed ahead, its windows glinting in the morning sun. The black SUV screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, and 4 heavily armed men poured out, storming into the building. Elijah was out of their car before it had fully stopped, his service weapon drawn, with Xavier right behind him. As they burst through the hospital doors, the sound of screams and gunfire echoed through the corridors. Terrified patients and staff fled in all directions, adding to the chaos. "You take the stairs, I'll cover the elevator," Xavier shouted, falling back into their old partnership rhythm without missing a beat. Elijah nodded grimly and headed for the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. His heart pounded in his ears, every second an eternity as he raced towards Gabrielle's floor. He burst onto the 5th floor, gun at the ready, to find a scene of nightmarish pandemonium. 2 of Strickland's men were engaged in a firefight with hospital security at one end of the corridor. At the other end, through the chaos, Elijah caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Calvin Strickland himself, dragging a struggling Gabrielle towards the fire exit. Time seemed to slow. Elijah raised his weapon, but Strickland was using Gabrielle as a human shield. Their eyes met across the corridor, predator and prey, though it wasn't clear which was which. In that moment, with his wife's life hanging in the balance and the fate of the city teetering on a knife's edge, Elijah Booker made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He lowered his gun. "Let her go, Strickland," he called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "It's me you want. I'm right here." Strickland's eyes narrowed, calculating. Then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, he drawled. The great Chief Booker, surrendering himself. How noble. He tightened his grip on Gabrielle, pressing his gun to her temple. "But who says I can't have both?" As if in slow motion, Elijah saw Strickland's finger tighten on the trigger. He saw the fear in Gabrielle's eyes turn to grim determination. And he saw her move, a sharp elbow to Strickland's ribs, a twist of her body. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Gabrielle stumbled forward, free of Strickland's grasp. Elijah's heart stopped, but there was no blood, no cry of pain. She was unharmed. Strickland, however, howled in agony, clutching his foot where Gabrielle's desperate move had caused him to shoot himself. In an instant, Elijah was on him, his fist connecting with Strickland's jaw with a satisfying crunch. The crime lord went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. As Elijah moved to secure Strickland, a shout from behind made him turn. Xavier had arrived, breathless, his own weapon trained on the fallen crime boss. "It's over," Xavier said, the relief evident in his voice. Elijah nodded, the adrenaline beginning to ebb. He turned to Gabrielle, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "Are you okay?" he murmured into her hair. She nodded against his chest, her body trembling but her voice steady. "I am now." As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air and the hospital staff began to regain control of the situation, Elijah Booker held his wife close, acutely aware of how close he had come to losing everything. The nightmare wasn't over. There would be questions to answer, investigations to endure, a department to rebuild. But in that moment, with Gabrielle safe in his arms and Xavier standing guard over the architect of their torment, Elijah allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in days: hope. As the morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the corridor, Atlanta began to wake to the news of what had transpired. The city had been shaken to its core, but it had survived. And in the crucible of that violent dawn, bonds had been broken, tested, and ultimately reforged, stronger than ever. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Elijah Booker was ready to face it, not alone, but with his wife by his side and his partner at his back. The fallen chief had risen again, tempered by fire and more determined than ever to protect and serve the city he loved.